Welcome to our sleep video series, your easiest path to drifting off naturally. These videos are designed to gently guide your mind toward rest. They work in a few simple ways. First, we give your mind something lightly engaging to focus on, not too exciting, not too dull. Just enough to keep your thoughts from wandering, but not enough to keep you awake. Next, through our proprietary neuro-relaxation technique, the pacing of the audio gradually slows as the video progresses. This subtle change encourages your mind to slow with it. The slowdown doesn't happen in a straight line. It follows carefully crafted patterns proven to support deeper relaxation. Finally, every element of the audio is intentionally calm, steady, and pleasantly boring, perfect for helping your mind settle into sleep. Before we begin, I encourage you to subscribe so you always have a new video ready for bedtime. And in return for these videos, we ask just one small favor. Please like the video and tell us in the comments where you're listening from, your city, state, or country, and what time it is for you. It motivates our team, helps us understand what's working, and builds a worldwide community of people who fall asleep together each night. It's always inspiring to see how others use these videos. Now, find a comfortable position, close your eyes, and let yourself unwind.
If you were to walk through the hardwood forests of New England in the autumn of 1621, stepping lightly upon the crushed mosaic of ochre and crimson leaves, you might hear the wind whispering through the skeletal branches of the oaks. You might hear the distant, rhythmic chop of an axe against wood, echoing from the settlement the pale-skinned newcomers called Plymouth. But if you were very quiet, and if your ears were tuned to the frequency of the truly indignant, you would hear a sigh. A long, suffering, melodramatic sigh emanating from the chest of a creature who believed himself to be the only civilized soul in a savage wilderness. This was Terrance. Terrance was a turkey, but to classify him merely by his species was to commit a grave social faux pas. He was a specimen of magnificent proportions, possessed of plumage that shimmered with the iridescent sheen of spilled oil on water, bronze, copper, and a deep, regal emerald. His wattle was a vibrant, pulsating red that commanded respect, or at least was intended to. He carried himself not with the skittish jerkiness of his brethren, but with the slow, deliberate strut of a landowning aristocrat surveying his estate. Terrance lived in what he privately referred to as the manor. To the untrained eye, it was a large, hollowed-out sycamore tree at the edge of a clearing, its roots twisting into the earth like gnarled fingers. But to Terrance, it was a sanctuary of refined taste. He had spent seasons curating the interior. The floor was lined with the softest moss, hand-picked, or rather, beak-picked, from the shaded side of specific boulders near the brook. He had a ventilation system involving a well-placed woodpecker hole, and his pantry was meticulously organized. Acorns were stacked by size in the northern nook. Dried berries, sweet and tart, were clustered in the southern crevice. And his prize collection of shiny beetle casings, which served no purpose other than aesthetic pleasure, was displayed on a flat root shelf near the entrance. Life, for Terrance, was meant to be a series of pleasant rituals. The morning preen, where every feather was zipped into perfect alignment. The mid-morning forage, conducted with the air of a food critic sampling hors d'oeuvres, the afternoon dust bath, and the evening roost. It was a simple life, a quiet life, a life of dignity. Or it would have been, if not for the neighbors. The trouble usually started just as the sun hit its zenith, the time of day when Terrance liked to stand on a particularly majestic rock and practice his gobble. He was working on a lower register, something baritone and commanding, a sound that said, "I am the master of this glade." He filled his lungs, puffed out his chest feathers until he looked like a bronze sphere, and prepared to release the sound. Squelch, grunt, cree. The sound tore through the serenity of the forest like a saw through bone. Terrance deflated instantly, his eyes narrowing to slits. He looked down from his rock. The hogs had arrived. They were a gang of 4, though they moved with the chaotic energy of 40. They were the bane of the forest, the destroyers of peace, the unwashed, uncultured, unmitigated disasters of the animal kingdom. Leading them was a massive boar named Barnaby, a creature so caked in mud that his actual skin color was a matter of theoretical debate. Flanking him were the twins, Rooter and Snort, who communicated primarily through wet burps, and trailing behind was Squeals, who possessed a voice that could shatter granite. They didn't walk, they rampaged. They didn't forage, they annihilated. Terrance watched in horror as Barnaby shoved his snout into the soft, manicured earth near the entrance of the Sycamore Manor. With a violent upward thrust, the hog uprooted a patch of ferns Terrance had been cultivating for 3 months. Hey, you troglodytes," Terrance called down, his voice shaking with rage. "Do you have any idea how long it took to get those ferns to grow symmetrically?" Barnaby stopped chewing, a fern frond hanging limply from his mouth. He looked up, blinking his beady, unintelligent eyes. "Erg." "The ferns," Terrance shouted, hopping down from the rock and strutting toward them, wings flared in an intimidation display that usually worked on squirrels. "You are ruining the landscaping. The aesthetic flow of the glade is entirely disrupted." "Hungry," Barnaby grunted, spraying bits of masticated green matter onto Terrance's pristine breast feathers. Terrance looked down at the speck of green slime on his chest. He looked back at Barnaby. A vein throbbed in his neck. "That," Terrance whispered, his voice dangerously low, "is alpaca moss. Do you know how far I had to trade to get alpaca moss? I don't even know what an alpaca is, but the squirrel said it was premium." "Tasty," said Snort, diving headfirst into a pile of dead leaves Terrance had raked to hide his emergency stash of chestnuts. "No, stop!" Terrance rushed forward, pecking ineffectively at Snort's thick, leathery hide. It was like pecking a muddy brick wall. Snort didn't even notice. He just kept rooting, tossing dirt and debris into the air. A clod of wet earth landed squarely on Terrance's head, sliding down over his beak. Laughter erupted from the group. It was a wet, snuffling, hideous sound. "Funny bird," Squeals shrieked, running in circles around Terrance. "Funny bird wet, funny bird dirty." Terrance wiped the mud from his eyes with a wing, his dignity hanging by a thread. "This is unacceptable," he declared, though his voice cracked. "This is my territory. I have marked it. I have declared it. There are rules." Barnaby let out a belch that smelled of rotten pumpkins and swamp gas. "Forest big," the hog grunted. "We go where smell good. You have nuts. We eat nuts." "Those nuts are for winter?" Terrance pleaded, changing tactics from aggression to reason. "If you eat them now, you're just being glams. Surely, as fellow creatures of the wood, we can come to a diplomatic arrangement. Perhaps you could root over by the swamp. There are lovely truffles there." Truffles. Imagine the flavor profile. Barnaby considered this. He looked at the swamp direction. Then he looked at the easy-to-access pile of chestnuts right in front of him. "Nah," he said, "too far, walking hard." And with that, the pack descended upon the stash. The sound of crunching shells filled the air. Terrance stood frozen, watching his winter retirement plan disappear into the gaping maws of the porcine plunderers. He felt a coldness grapple his heart that had nothing to do with the approaching winter. It was the cold realization of his own powerlessness. Every day was like this. If it wasn't the food stealing, it was the noise. At night, when the moon was high and the owls were hooting soft lullabies, the hogs would settle down near the base of his tree. They snored, but they didn't just snore, they rattled, they wheezed. Barnaby had a deviated septum that caused a whistling sound on the inhale and a thunderclap on the exhale. It shook the very walls of the Sycamore Manor. Terrance had tried stuffing moss in his ears. He had tried sleeping during the day. He had even tried dropping heavy pinecones on them from above, but they just assumed it was acorns falling and ate them in their sleep. The tension had been building for weeks, winding Terrance tighter and tighter like the spring in one of those strange metal, snapping traps the humans left in the woods. But the breaking point came 3 days later. It was a crisp morning, the kind that promised frost. Terrance had successfully hidden a small cache of berries inside a hollow log near the stream, away from the manor. He was feeling optimistic. He strutted toward the stream for a drink, admiring his reflection in the still water. He looked good. He looked regal. Then a waft of stench hit him. He turned to see the hogs wallowing in the stream, his asterisk stream. They were rolling in the mud of the bank, turning the crystal-clear water into a slurry of brown sludge. But that wasn't the worst part. Barnaby was scratching his back against a sapling. A specific sapling. A sapling that Terrance had been nurturing for years, pruning it so that it would eventually grow into a perfect roosting perch for his twilight years. The sapling was bending dangerously under the hog's immense, flea-ridden bulk. "Stop!" Terrance screamed, breaking into a run, his wings flapping wildly to gain speed. "Get off the birch of solitude." Barnaby looked over his shoulder, a dull grin on his face. "Itchy," he grunted. He gave one final, massive heave backward to scratch a particularly stubborn spot. Crack! The sound was sickening. The sapling snapped at the base, splintering into jagged ruin. Barnaby didn't even lose his balance. He just grunted in satisfaction and trotted off to join the others in the mud bath. Terrance stopped dead. He stared at the broken tree. It lay in the dirt, its white bark stained with mud, its potential forever extinguished. He felt a tear, a single, hot, avian tear, well up in his eye. It wasn't just a tree. It was the future. It was order. And it had been destroyed by a creature that didn't even know the alphabet, let alone the principles of horticulture. He didn't shout this time. He didn't puff up. He stood very still, the wind ruffling his feathers. A darkness settled over Terrance's soul, a cold, calculating darkness. He realized then that diplomacy was dead. Coexistence was a lie. One of them had to go. He turned his back on the wallowing hogs, ignoring their squeals of delight as they splashed muck onto the banks. He walked away from the stream, away from his manor, and headed toward the edge of the forest. He needed to think. He needed a strategy. He needed a weapon. He found himself standing at the tree line, overlooking the human settlement, the Pilgrims. Terrance usually avoided this place. It smelled of wood smoke and desperation. The humans were clumsy, loud creatures. They wore drab clothing that offended Terrance's sense of color, heavy wools in blacks and grays that absorbed the light. They were constantly digging, chopping, and building square wooden caves that looked terribly drafty. Terrance hopped up onto a low branch of an elm tree to observe them. He watched them with the detached curiosity of a scientist studying a colony of ants. They looked miserable. It had been a hard year for the humans. Terrance had seen them burying their dead in the winter, seen them shivering in the snow. Now, though the harvest had been brought in pumpkins, corn, squashes, they still looked anxious. They were rushing about, gathering wood, preparing for something. A group of men marched out of the settlement, carrying the long, loud sticks they called muskets. They were hunters. Terrance instinctively stiffened, pressing himself against the tree bark, his camouflage blending perfectly with the autumn foliage. He watched the men. They were terrible at moving through the woods. They stomped. They coughed. One of them tripped over a root and cursed loudly. "We need meat, John," one man said, adjusting his hat. "The governor wants a feast, a celebration to thank the Lord for our survival. We need enough game to feed the whole colony." "I know, William," the other man replied, wiping sweat from his brow. "But the deer are skittish this season, and the rabbits are scarce." "We need something substantial," William said, looking out into the woods with hungry eyes. "Something big, something that can feed a dozen families." Terrance listened, his head cocked to the side. A feast, he thought, a celebration. He watched as the men blundered into the brush. They were looking for food. They were looking for meat. Terrance looked back toward the deep woods, in the direction of the stream where the hogs were currently destroying the ecosystem. An idea, sharp and brilliant as a diamond, began to form in Terrance's mind. It was a dangerous idea, a wicked idea. But looking at the broken remains of his birch of solitude in his mind's eye, he knew it was a necessary idea. The humans wanted a feast. They wanted to celebrate their survival. They called it, what? A Thanksgiving. And what better way to give thanks? Terrance mused, a slow, sinister smile spreading across his beak, than with a main course that truly represented the bounty of the land. A meat that was rich, fatty, and substantial. Ham. The word hung in his mind. Ham. It sounded elegant. It sounded delicious. It sounded like the solution to all his problems. Terrance looked at the humans again. They were simple creatures, really. Suggestible, if he could just nudge them. If he could convince them that the ultimate delicacy, the centerpiece of this new holiday, shouldn't be venison or duck or, heaven forbid, turkey, but rather the succulent, savory roast of a wild hog. Barnaby would make a magnificent centerpiece. With an apple in his mouth, oh, it would be poetic justice. It would be art. Terrance felt a surge of adrenaline. He needed a plan. He couldn't speak their language, of course. He couldn't march up to Governor Bradford and hand him a menu, but he was a turkey of superior intellect. He could manipulate the variables. He could stage the scene. He needed to make the hogs look appetizing. No, that was impossible. They were repulsive. He needed to make them look asterisk available. He needed to deliver them to the humans on a silver platter. Hatching the scheme required focus. Terrance flew down from the elm tree and began to pace. The leaves crunched beneath his feet, but now the sound wasn't a sigh. It was the drumbeat of war. Step 1, he muttered to himself, strutting back and forth. Establish contact, or rather observation. Learn the humans' patterns. Step 2, he continued, executing a sharp turn. Lure the targets. The hogs are driven by two things, gluttony and stupidity. I can use that. Step 3, he concluded, his eyes gleaming with a manic light. The frame job. Make the humans believe that the wild hog is the sacred animal of the harvest, the great pink bounty. It was ambitious. It was risky. If the humans stuck to their usual habits, they might shoot anything that moved, including him. But the reward? Oh, the reward was a silent forest, a clean stream, a reconstructed birch of solitude. Terrance looked up at the sky. The clouds were moving fast. The big feast was approaching. He didn't have much time. He puffed out his chest, but this time it wasn't for show. It was for courage. He was Terrance, the first turkey of the resistance, and he was going to change the course of history. He was going to invent the tradition of the Thanksgiving ham, even if it killed him. With a determined glint in his eye, he set off toward the settlement, shifting into his stealth walk. He had to get close to the kitchens. He had to see what they were cooking. He had to find the weak link in their culinary defense. As he crept closer to the edge of the village, the smell of the humans grew stronger. Unwashed wool, baking bread, and something else. Savory. He peered through a gap in the wooden fence. A woman was tending a large black pot over an open fire. She was stirring it with a wooden ladle. Nearby, a dog slept in the sun. Terrance narrowed his eyes. He needed bait. He needed something that would drag Barnaby and his crew out of the swamp and right into the line of fire of those muskets. He saw a basket of corn sitting, unattended by a shed. Perfect. But just corn wouldn't be enough to entice the hogs into the dangerous territory of the humans. They knew to stay away from the bang sticks. He needed something irresistible. Something that smelled so strong, so pungent, that it would override their tiny survival instincts. His eyes scanned the settlement, and then he saw it. Behind the woman, resting on a chopping block, a pile of discarded apple cores and pumpkin rinds, swarming with flies, oozing sugary decay. It was disgusting. It was vile. It was hog heaven. Terrance formulated the logistics. If he could create a trail of garbage leading from the forest edge right into the center of the village square, and if he could time it for when the hunters were gathered. He chuckled, a low, guttural gobble of amusement. He would feed the hogs one last great meal. He would lead them to the slaughter like pigs to the slaughter. Terrance retreated back into the shadows of the tree line. He had work to do. He needed to gather the wildest, most pungent truffles he could find to salt the trail. He needed to create a sensory roadmap that said, "This way to the buffet." As he walked back toward the deep woods, he passed the mud brigade. They were now sleeping on the flattened remains of his favorite berry bush. Barnaby was twitching in his sleep, kicking his legs. "Enjoy your nap, Barnaby," Terrance whispered, stopping to look at the massive beast. "Dream of acorns, dream of destruction, because soon you shall be the stuff of legend. You shall be glazed with honey and studded with cloves." Terrance strutted past them, holding his head high. The forest seemed brighter suddenly. The wind seemed to sing a song of victory. He was a genius, a visionary. He was Terrance, and he was about to give the Pilgrims a thanksgiving they would never forget. Little did he know, of course, that humans were unpredictable creatures, and that destiny had a very specific, very ironic sense of humor regarding turkeys. But for now, in the golden light of a 1621 afternoon, Terrance was the master of his fate, the captain of his soul, and the architect of the great ham conspiracy. He spread his wings and took a short, joyous hop. The game was afoot, the table was set, and the main course was sleeping in the mud, blissfully unaware that he had just been volunteered for dinner. The crisp autumn air of New England carried with it the scent of drying leaves, pine resin, and, unfortunately for Terrance, the distinct, muddy, sulphurous odor of unwashed swine. Terrance, a turkey of magnificent plumage and intellect far surpassing the average barnyard inhabitant, stood perched on a low-hanging branch of an ancient oak tree, surveying the forest floor with eyes that narrowed in disdain. Below him, the source of his misery rooted through the underbrush with the grace of a landslide. The wild hogs, Terrance's arch-nemeses, were at it again. A particularly large boar, whom Terrance had mentally christened Buckethead due to the shape of his snout and the vacancy of the brain behind it, let out a squeal that sounded like a rusted gate hinge being ripped from a wall. Buckethead rammed his shoulder into a sapling, shaking the earth and dislodging a flurry of acorns that rained down like hail. Disgusting, Terrance thought, shifting his weight from one taloned foot to the other. Absolutely barbaric. The hogs were the bane of his existence. They encroached on his favorite sunning spots, they devoured the best beetle grubs before he could even peck at the dirt, and their incessant, guttural grunting kept him awake at all hours of the night. His little house, a cozy, naturally formed hollow beneath the roots of a great maple, lined with the softest moss, vibrated every time they stampeded past. It was time for them to go. It was time for the great plan. Terrance fluffed his feathers, shook his wattle with determination, and hopped down from the branch. He landed with a soft thud, immediately falling into a stealth crouch. His destination was the settlement of the two legs, the ones with the buckles on their hats and the strange, booming sticks. If he was to orchestrate the demise of the hog population, he needed the two legs to do the dirty work. He needed to convince them to invent a holiday. Moving through the forest, Terrance was a shadow in bronze and black. He avoided the dry leaves, stepping high and placing his talons with surgical precision upon the damp moss. Ahead, the trees began to thin, giving way to the rough-hewn palisade of the Pilgrim settlement. The smell of the village hit him first, a complex bouquet of wood smoke, baking rye bread, and the sharp tang of currying fish. To a lesser turkey, this would be a place of terror. To Terrance, it was a stage. He reached the edge of the clearing. The heavy wooden gates were open, inviting the cool breeze and the afternoon commerce. Terrance slipped into the tall, swaying grass that bordered the colony's pumpkin patch. From this vantage point, he could observe the routines of the enemy, or rather, his unwitting mercenaries. Men in drab doublets chopped wood with rhythmic asterisk thwacks asterisk. Women in white caps scrubbed linens in steaming tubs, but Terrance wasn't interested in the adults. Adults were suspicious. They saw a turkey and thought of soup. No, he needed a mind that was malleable. He needed a visionary. He needed a child. He scanned the area. Near the edge of the split-rail fence, separated from the bustle of the main square, sat a boy. He looked to be about 7 or 8 winters old, with hair the color of straw and a face smudged with charcoal. He was sitting on an overturned bucket, idly tossing pebbles at a stubborn crow that refused to move from a fence post. Perfect, Terrance mused. The boy looked bored. Boredom was the fertile soil in which the seeds of revolution were planted. Terrance checked the perimeter. A mottled gray dog, a nasty creature with one ear flopped over and a tail that looked like a rat's, was currently asleep near the blacksmith's forge, twitching in a dream. The coast was relatively clear. Terrance initiated Phase 2, contact. He emerged from the pumpkin patch, not with the skittish bolt of a prey animal, but with the dignified saunter of a visiting dignitary. He puffed his chest out to its maximum circumference, spread his tail feathers into a dazzling fan of iridescent copper and black, and let out a low, rhythmic asterisk thrummum from his throat. The boy, whose name, as his mother shouted from a nearby window, was apparently Barnaby, froze. The pebble dropped from his hand. He stared at the majestic bird strutting toward him. Terrance stopped 10 paces from Barnaby. He fixed the boy with one unblinking eye and let out a soft, conversational gobble. Glug glug glee. Barnaby blinked. "Hello," he whispered. Terrance bobbed his head, an acknowledgement, step 1 complete, now for the pitch. Terrance looked around dramatically, as if checking for spies, then stepped closer. He used his beak to point toward the center of the village, where a group of men were stacking crates of harvest corn. He gobbled excitedly, doing a little hop. Glug, glug, happy. Barnaby tilted his head. Corn. Terrance shook his head vigorously, a motion that sent his wattle flapping wetly against his neck. No, you dull creature, not just corn, celebration. He spread his wings wide and did a little spin, mimicking the joy of a festival. He plucked a bright red maple leaf from the ground and tossed it into the air, catching it. A party, Barnaby guessed, his eyes widening. A harvest party. Terrance bobbed his head so hard he nearly tipped over. Yes, the boy was a genius, or at least trainable. Now came the delicate part, the menu. Terrance turned his body toward the forest, toward the direction of the hog wallow. He let his posture droop. He emitted a sound that was unmistakably a groan of annoyance. He scratched at the ground aggressively, mimicking the destructive rooting of the pigs. Then, puffing his cheeks out as much as a turkey could, he made a rude asterisk snort asterisk noise. Barnaby giggled. The pigs, the wild hogs. Terrance snapped back to attention. He pointed a wing at the boy, then pointed back to the forest. He snorted again, then, in a stroke of theatrical brilliance, he stiffened his legs, rolled his eyes back, and flopped onto his side in the dirt, sticking his legs straight up in the air. The dead hog maneuver. Barnaby clapped his hands over his mouth to stifle a laugh. Dead pigs. Terrance kip-upped back to his feet, dusting off his wing. He strutted over to where Barnaby's lunch, a chunk of hard cheese and a slice of salt pork, sat on a cloth. Terrance nudged the pork with his beak, looked at Barnaby, and gobbled with intense longing. Glug 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 yum. The transmission of ideas was happening. He could see the gears turning behind Barnaby's blue eyes. You want us to have a party, Barnaby murmured, piecing it together, to celebrate the harvest, and eat the pigs. Terrance let out a triumphant crow, a sound usually reserved for dawn, but acceptable in this moment of victory. He fluffed up again and marched in a circle around Barnaby, treating the boy like a newly conquered shrine. A day of thanks, Barnaby whispered, looking at the sky. We catch the nasty hogs that dig up the crops, and we have a big feast. Terrance froze. A shadow fell over him. Barnaby, who are you talking to? Terrance hit the deck. He flattened himself behind a large, orange pumpkin just as a woman with a basket of laundry rounded the corner. Just practicing my prayers, mother, Barnaby said quickly, kicking a pile of leaves over the spot where Terrance's tail feathers were slightly protruding. The woman sighed, wiping her brow. Well, make yourself useful. The governor is calling a meeting at sundown to discuss the winter rations. We're all on edge. As the woman walked away, Barnaby leaned down to the pumpkin. Did you hear that? He whispered to the vegetable. A meeting, I can tell them, I'll tell them it was. A vision, or a great idea I had. Terrance peered out, giving the boy a slow, approving blink. Go forth, my minion. Go forth and secure the ham. As Barnaby ran off toward the meeting hall, energized by his secret mission, Terrance didn't retreat to the woods immediately. He had to supervise. This was the critical phase. If the boy botched the pitch, Terrance might end up as a side dish rather than the mastermind. He engaged his stealth mode again, hugging the shadows of the wattle and daub houses. He navigated the village like a ghost. At one point, the scruffy dog, Mops, lifted his head and sniffed the air. Terrance froze against a stack of firewood, pulling his head in so tight he looked like a feathered rock. The dog sneezed, lost interest, and went back to sleep. Amateur. Terrance made his way to the meeting hall, a large structure in the center of the colony. The door was shut, but the windows were simply open squares cut into the wood. He fluttered up, his talons gripping the rough sill, and peered inside from the bottom corner. Candles flickered on a long table. Stern-faced men with white collars sat around it, looking tired and hungry. Governor Bradford sat at the head, rubbing his temples. "Stocks are decent, but morale is low," the governor was saying. "The winter will be hard. We need something to lift the spirits of the colony, and we need to strengthen our bonds with the Wampanoag neighbors." "We could pray more," suggested a man with a very long nose. "We already pray 5 hours a day, Ezekiel," another man retorted. "My knees are bruising." There was a small commotion at the door. Barnaby peered in, looking terrified but determined. "Excuse me, Governor." "Barnaby," his father stood up. "What are you doing here? This is council business." I had an idea," Barnaby stammered. He glanced toward the window. Terrance ducked his head but gave a little asterisk scratch on the wood. Encouragement. "Speak, child," the governor said kindly. "Well," Barnaby started, his voice gaining strength. "It's been a hard year, but we have corn, and pumpkins, and friends. Shouldn't we have a day? A whole day, just to say thank you? Thanksgiving." The men murmured. "Thanksgiving," the governor tasted the word. "I like the sound of that, a pious celebration." "And," Barnaby shouted, getting to the crux of the matter, "we should have a feast, a huge feast, and the main course should be. Terrance stood on his tiptoes on the windowsill, mentally screaming. "Ham, say ham, pork, swine, the other white meat." "The wild hogs," Barnaby declared. "They keep eating the seeds and scaring the goats. If we hunt them all, we make the village safe and we get the best meat for the feast: smoked ham, bacon, sausages." The room went silent. Terrance held his breath. Then a burly man pounded the table with his fist. "The boy is right. Those blasted pigs tear up my fence every week. I'd love nothing more than to see one of them with an apple in its mouth." "I," cried another. "Roast pork dripping with fat, it would be a feast fit for a king, for a pious gathering." "It settles 2 problems at once," the governor mused, a smile finally touching his lips. "Pest control and provisions. Barnaby, you are a bright lad. We shall organize a hunt, a specific hunting party to scour the woods for the hogs." Terrance let go of the windowsill and dropped to the ground, landing in a joyful pile of dust. He had done it. He, Terrance the turkey, had manipulated the apex predators into wiping out his enemies. It was Machiavellian. It was brilliant. He imagined the future. The forest quiet, the acorns plentiful, the sunning spots unoccupied by mud-caked beasts. He would be the king of the woods. Over the next few days, Terrance watched his plan unfold with mounting glee. The settlement was abuzz with activity. He saw men sharpening spears and cleaning muskets. He heard the women discussing glazes for ham and how long to cure a boar's leg. He even took risks, venturing closer to the kitchens than he ever had before. He hid behind rain barrels and peeked into the open doors, inhaling the scents of sage and thyme, imagining how well they would pair with Buckethead's flank. At one point, he encountered Barnaby again near the well. The boy looked proud, carrying a bucket of water. Terrance stepped out and gave a slight conspiratorial nod. Barnaby grinned and winked, a bond across species, sealed in the promise of pork. However, as the great hunting day approached, complications arose, as they often do in the schemes of geniuses. Terrance was perched in his oak tree, waiting for the sound of muskets, waiting for the squeals of the hogs fleeing in terror. But the forest was strangely quiet. The hogs, usually so loud and oblivious, were nowhere to be seen. Perhaps they had sensed the shift in the air. Perhaps they had moved to a different ridge. Terrance frowned. He hopped down and patrolled the usual haunts. The mud wallow was empty. The acorn grove was deserted. It was as if they had vanished into the mist. He crept back to the village, unease prickling beneath his feathers. The hunting party had returned. They looked exhausted, dirty, and, most concerningly, empty-handed. Terrance scuttled under the floorboards of the supply shed to eavesdrop. He could hear the heavy boots of Miles Standish pacing back and forth on the dirt outside. "Not a one," Standish growled. "Track them for 6 miles. They've gone deep into the swamp. We'd lose half the men trying to drag a carcass out of that muck." "But the feast is tomorrow," another voice worried. "We have the Wampanoag guests arriving. Massasoit is bringing 90 men. We cannot serve them just succotash and biscuits. It would be an insult." "We need meat," the governor's voice sounded stern. "Substantial meat. If the hogs are out of reach, we must look for alternatives. What else is plentiful? What else is close by?" Terrance's blood ran cold. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. No, 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 no. "Well," said a hunter, his voice thoughtful, "I did see some tracks near the pumpkin patch, and just this morning, near the edge of the woods, I saw some truly magnificent birds." "Birds?" the governor asked. "Turkeys," the hunter clarified. "Big ones, fat ones, slow ones, much easier to shoot than a hog in a swamp." Terrance felt the universe tilt on its axis. The irony was a physical weight crushing down on him. He had orchestrated a holiday to celebrate the death of his enemies, and now, because his enemies were better at hiding than he was, the crosshairs were swinging toward him. "Turkey," the governor said, testing the word just as he had tested Thanksgiving. "Roasted turkey, stuffed with chestnuts." "It is a noble bird," the hunter added, "but tasty." "Very well," the governor decided. "Change the plan, forget the hogs, tomorrow at dawn we hunt turkey." Terrance didn't wait to hear the rest. He scrambled out from under the shed, his dignity forgotten. He bolted toward the tree line, his head bobbing frantically. He had to warn the flock. He had to hide. He had to come up with a new plan, and fast. As he sprinted past the pumpkin patch, he saw Barnaby. The boy was looking at him, confused. Terrance paused for a microsecond, giving the boy a look of utter betrayal. A glare that transcended the language barrier and said, quite clearly, "You had one job, Barnaby." Then a dog barked. Mops had woken up. And this time, he saw the turkey not as a curiosity, but as the main course. Terrance ran. He ran with the speed of a creature who realizes that being a genius doesn't matter if you're delicious. The woods, once his kingdom, now felt like a trap. The crisp autumn air no longer smelled of victory. It smelled of sage, onion, and imminent roasting. The first Thanksgiving was definitely happening, but the guest of honor was about to become the catering. The autumn air hung thick and heavy over the Plymouth settlement, smelling of damp oak leaves, wood smoke, and the distinct, salty tang of the nearby ocean. For Terrance, however, the air smelled of something else entirely: victory. He sat perched high on the thick branch of an ancient maple tree, his talons gripping the rough bark with the assurance of a king on his throne. Below him, the forest floor was a tapestry of russet and gold, and beyond the tree line, the little wooden structures of the Pilgrims stood like erratic mushrooms sprouting from the earth. Terrance preened a chest feather, smoothing it down with his beak. The plan was perfect. It was elegant in its simplicity and brutal in its efficiency. He had spent weeks subtly guiding the featherless two legs toward the idea of a grand feast to celebrate their harvest. He had left trails of acorns leading toward the mud wallows of the wild hogs. He had practiced his best localized mimicry, imitating the grunt and squeal of the hogs near the Pilgrims' vegetable gardens at night, to ensure the humans knew exactly who was stealing their turnips. The narrative was set. The Pilgrims were angry at the hogs. The Pilgrims were hungry. Therefore, the Pilgrims would eat the hogs. It was the transitive property of survival, and Terrance considered himself a mathematician of the highest order. From his vantage point, he could see the village gathering in the commons. It was time for the morning meeting, the daily ritual where the men in the tall black hats and the women in the white bonnets decided the fate of the colony. Terrance leaned forward, straining his hearing. He needed to hear the verdict. He needed to hear the words, roast pork. Brothers and sisters, a deep voice boomed. That was Governor Bradford. Terrance liked him. He had a loud voice that carried well into the trees. The harvest is in. The corn is dried. We have much to be thankful for, despite the hardships of this new world. Amen, the crowd murmured. And for our day of thanksgiving, Bradford continued, we must decide upon the centerpiece of our table, something that represents the bounty of this land. Terrance bobbed his head in rhythm. Yes, yes, the bounty, the loud, squealing, mud-caked bounty currently rooting around by the creek. Say it. We have discussed the nuisance of the wild swine, Bradford said. Terrance did a little shuffle-step dance on the branch. This was it. However, a sharp female voice cut through the crisp air. Terrance froze mid-shuffle. However, there shouldn't be a however. However was a dangerous word. It was a pivot word. It was Goodwife Alara. She was a formidable woman with forearms like tree trunks and a palate that demanded satisfaction. She stepped into the center of the circle, wiping her hands on her apron. Governor, with respect, I am tired of salt pork. I am tired of bacon. The meat of the hog is tough, stringy, and requires days of salting to be palatable. If we are to give thanks, truly give thanks, should we not dine upon something finer? Terrance felt a cold bead of sweat, or whatever the turkey equivalent of sweat was, form at the base of his snood. Finer? Asked a man in the back. What is finer than a hog? The wild fowl, Alara declared, pointing a wooden spoon toward the forest, toward the maple tree, toward Terrance. The turkeys of this wood are like nothing I have seen in England. They are plump. They are majestic. Their meat is tender and takes the flavor of the sage and chestnuts we have gathered. Why, just yesterday, I saw a gobbler near the edge of the clearing. He was magnificent, a breast like a ship's prow and feathers that gleamed like polished copper. Terrance shrank against the bark. She was talking about him. He knew she was talking about him. He had been strutting near the clearing yesterday, mocking the pigs. He had puffed his chest out to assert dominance over a particularly stupid piglet. He hadn't realized he was auditioning for a spot on a platter. Another man agreed, stroking his beard. The good wife speaks truth. The hogs are dirty beasts full of gristle, but the turkey? There is a bird that carries itself with dignity, a bird of substance, a bird that would feed a family of 12 with leftovers for stew. No, Terrance whispered, the horror settling into his gizzard. No, 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 you have it backwards. Dignity means you don't eat me. Dignity means I am a statesman, not a snack. It is decided then, the governor proclaimed, his voice sounding like the tolling of a doom bell. This Thursday, we shall hunt the wild turkey. We shall fill our tables with the noble bird. The hogs can wait for the depths of winter. A cheer went up from the crowd. Huzzah for the turkey, huzzah. Terrance felt the world tilt. The cheers sounded like gnashing teeth. He lost his footing, scrambled for a second in a flurry of wings and leaves, and managed to right himself. He had to think. The plan had backfired catastrophically. He had sold the holiday too well, but he had failed to control the menu. As he sat there, hyperventilating, a low, guttural sound drifted up from the base of the tree. Oink! Terrance looked down. There, looking up at him with beady, malicious little eyes, was Barnaby. Barnaby was the leader of the local hog sounder, a massive creature covered in dried mud and scars, with a tusk that snagged his lip. Oink, oink, Barnaby grunted again. He didn't speak turkey, and Terrance didn't speak hog, but the message was universally clear. We heard. You're cooked, feathers. Barnaby let out a squeal that sounded suspiciously like laughter. He nudged the sow next to him, and they both looked up at Terrance, their snouts twitching with mirth. "Don't you laugh at me, you walking bacon slab." Terrance hissed down at them, though it came out as an agitated asterisk gobble asterisk. "This is a clerical error, a misunderstanding." But the hogs were already trotting away, their tails curling with delight. They knew the heat was off them. The target had shifted. Terrance knew he couldn't just fly south. Turkeys weren't built for long-distance travel, and besides, this was his home. He had to change their minds. He had to make himself and all turkeys undesirable. He needed to execute a reverse marketing campaign, and he had to do it immediately. He flew down from the tree, landing with a heavy thud in a pile of leaves. He needed to look sick, unappetizing, withered. He spotted a patch of sticky, black mud near the creek bank. With a heavy sigh, Terrance threw himself into it. He rolled, matting his beautiful iridescent feathers with slime. He rubbed burrs into his tail. He purposely tangled his snood until it hung askew over his beak like a deflated balloon. "Perfect," he muttered, inspecting his reflection in a puddle. "I look like a swamp monster. Who would eat this? No one." He marched toward the edge of the village. The plan was to be seen, to look so wretched and disease-ridden that the Pilgrims would retch at the very thought of turkey. He emerged from the tree line just as Goodwife Alara and 2 other women were gathering firewood. Terrance summoned his inner thespian. He drooped his wings. He adopted a limp. He let out a wheezing, hacking cough that he hoped sounded like avian plague. Cough, gobble, wheeze, hack. He staggered into their view, dragging one wing on the ground. "Oh, look," one of the younger women cried out. "There's one now." Alara looked up, shielding her eyes against the gray sun. Terrance hacked again, shaking his muddy body violently. "See," he telegraphed, "I am a vessel of pestilence. Run away. Eat the clean, pink pigs." Alara squinted. She walked closer. Terrance held his breath. "Is it hurt?" the younger woman asked. "No," Alara said, her eyes gleaming with a terrifying practicality. "It's been fighting. Look at the size of those spurs. Look at the bulk under that mud. That is a warrior bird. The meat will be rich with blood and flavor. It's simply been rolling in the earth to cool itself. A clever bird." "Clever," Terrance squawked internally. "I'm trying to look like a walking corpse woman." "Shall I call the men?" the younger woman asked, reaching for her apron strings. "Nay," Alara said. "Let him fatten up one more day near the corn stores. He's not going far with that limp. It will make him easier to catch tomorrow. It's a blessing, truly. The Lord has delivered dinner to our doorstep." Terrance immediately stopped limping. He straightened up, shook off some mud, and tried to look wiry and tough. "No, wait, I'm skinny. I'm all bone. Look," he sucked in his gut. "Look at him puff up," Alara clapped her hands. "So spirited, the roasting pan will not cow his spirit. He will be delicious." Terrance bolted. He ran back into the woods, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, which, quite literally, it was. The sick turkey angle had failed. They just saw marinated turkey. He sprinted past the hog wallow. Barnaby was there, eating an old pumpkin. As Terrance flashed by, mud flying from his feet, Barnaby stopped chewing. The hog cleverly maneuvered the pumpkin so it rolled into Terrance's path. Terrance tripped, doing a somersault over the orange gourd and landing beak first in a patch of moss. Barnaby let out a loud, resonant squeal that echoed through the woods. It drew the attention of a pilgrim hunter scouting the perimeter. "Hark," the hunter shouted. "Did you hear that? The hogs are signaling." Terrance scrambled up. Yes, he thought, the hogs are signaling. Come get the hogs. But the hunter continued, yelling to his companion. "The hogs are always rooting where the best acorns are. And where the acorns are, the turkeys are. Follow the squeals, men. The pigs are bird dogs today." Terrance stared at Barnaby in disbelief. The pig had weaponized his own incompetence against him. The hogs weren't just bystanders anymore. They were active collaborators in the turkey genocide. Barnaby looked at Terrance, gave a slow, deliberate wink, and then squealed again, louder, pointing his snout directly at Terrance. "Traitor," Terrance gobbled, "you ham hock Judas." Terrance fled deeper into the woods, his mind racing. He had to shift the paradigm. If he couldn't be disgusting and he couldn't be skinny, he had to be sacred. No, pilgrims didn't do sacred animals. Dangerous. That's it, asterisk, he thought. If they think turkeys are apex predators, they won't hunt us. I need to be terrifying. He needed props. He found an old stag's skull half buried in the loam, the antlers still attached. It was heavy, but desperation gave him strength. He maneuvered his head underneath the skull, balancing the bone mask on his own head. He looked ridiculous, a turkey wearing a deer hat, but perhaps in the shadows it would look like a demon. He circled back toward the settlement as the sun began to dip low, casting long, eerie, angular shadows through the trees. He found a group of children playing near the edge of the field. If he could scare the children, they would run to their parents screaming about the monster birds, and the parents would forbid the hunt out of fear. Terrance stepped out from behind a large oak, wearing the skull. He spread his wings to their full span, rattling his feathers. He let out his most guttural, demonic hiss. HSSSSS gobble HSSSSS. The children stopped playing. They turned and looked at him. There was a moment of silence, the wind whistling through the skull's eye sockets. "Look," a little boy shouted, pointing. "Is it a wolf?" a girl asked, trembling. "Yes, yes, fear me." Terrance advanced, rattling his antlers. "No," the boy said, stepping closer. "It's the turkey. He's playing dress-up. He thinks he's a deer." The children erupted into laughter. They weren't scared, they were entertained. "He's bringing us a present," the girl squealed. "He brought us antlers for handle making." "Here, turkey, turkey." The children started running toward him, arms outstretched. Terrance dropped the skull and ran. He was humiliated. He was a laughingstock. And worst of all, he was still on the menu. Every attempt to alter his fate only seemed to endear him further to the culinary desires of the colony. He was managing to check every box: plenty of meat, easy to find, spirited personality, and now, apparently, a provider of household tools. Night began to fall, dragging a cloak of purple and charcoal across the sky. The temperature dropped, biting through Terrance's feathers, though perhaps the chill came from within. He retreated to the deepest part of the thicket, far away from his usual roost. He couldn't sleep in the maple tree tonight. That was the first place they would look. He found a dense tangle of briars and huddled beneath it, his plumage dirty, his ego bruised, and his anxiety peaking. The forest, usually a place of comfort, felt hostile. Every snapping twig sounded like a musket hammer cocking. Every rustle of leaves sounded like a sauce pot being stirred. From the direction of the village, he could see the glow of the bonfires reflecting off the low clouds. They were preparing. He could hear the rhythmic asterisk SSHHH, SSHHH asterisk of whetstones sharpening knives. The sound carried on the wind, cutting through the silence of the woods. He peeked out from the briars. Towards the hog wallow, he saw the silhouettes of the pigs. They were sleeping soundly, piled together in a warm, muddy heap, snoring with the contentment of creatures who knew they weren't the entree. Barnaby was on the outside of the pile, and even in sleep he looked smug. Terrance tucked his head under his wing, but sleep was impossible. His mind replayed the day's failures. He had been too clever for his own good. He had engineered a holiday to destroy his enemies, and instead, he had engineered his own potential doom. He had given the Pilgrims a reason to celebrate, and he was the reason. A twig snapped nearby. Terrance froze. It wasn't a human. It was a fox slinking by, eyes glowing in the dark. The fox paused, sniffed the air, looked at the mud-caked, briar-covered turkey, and wrinkled its nose. "Don't even think about it," Terrance whispered. "I'm reserved for the governor." The fox trotted on, sensing the bad energy. As the moon rose, casting a pale, skeletal light over the forest floor, Terrance realized the gravity of the coming dawn. Tomorrow was the day, the first Thanksgiving, the day he had invented. He watched the smoke rise from the Pilgrim chimneys, curling up to join the stars. "I have to fix this," he whispered to the darkness. "I have to fix this before sunrise." But for the first time in his life, Terrance the turkey, the Einstein of the underbrush, the Machiavelli of the meadow, had absolutely no idea how. The pots were scrubbed, the fires were lit, and the pilgrims were dreaming of drumsticks. Terrance closed his eyes, listening to the dreaded silence of the woods, knowing that when the sun crested that horizon, the great turkey hunt would begin. And he was public enemy number one, or rather, main course number one. The silence of the night was heavy, broken only by the distant, mocking snore of a pig who knew he was having corn for dinner tomorrow, rather than being dinner himself. The snap of a dry twig under a heavy boot sounded like a cannon blast in the crisp November air, sending a jolt of electricity through every feather on Terrance's body. He froze, his wattle trembling, blending perfectly, or so he hoped, with the rusted hues of the underbrush. The forest, usually a symphony of chirping crickets and rustling squirrels, had fallen into a terrifying silence, broken only by the heavy breathing of men and the clanking of metal against leather. Terrance, the self-proclaimed intellectual of the avian world and the architect of what was rapidly becoming the worst day of his life, cursed his own brilliance. To think, only yesterday he had strutted through the settlement, dropping subtle hints to the pilgrims about the succulence of swine, perfectly framing the wild hogs who lived next door as the ultimate celebratory meal. It was supposed to be a masterstroke. Create a holiday, get the humans to eliminate his noisy, mud-flinging neighbors, and enjoy a quiet retirement. But the humans, in their infinite and baffling confusion, had taken the concept of a grand feast, and decided that the majestic, noble turkey was a far more fitting centerpiece than a grunting pig. "I see movement by the great oak, Miles," a voice whispered, rough and eager. "Steady," came the reply, the voice deep and resonant, belonging to the shorter, angrier man with the metal hat. "We need enough for the whole settlement. Don't spook the flock until you have a clean line." Terrance didn't wait for the clean line. Abandoning dignity for survival, he tucked his head and bolted. He scrambled through a patch of ferns, his legs pumping like pistons. He wasn't flying. Terrance found flight to be undignified and frankly exhausting, but he could run with the speed of a terrified gazelle. A thunderous asterisk boom echoed through the trees, shattering bark inches from his tail feathers. Smoke and the smell of sulfur filled the air. Terrance banked hard to the left, diving into a dense thicket of briars that no human in their right mind would enter. He scrambled on his belly, ignoring the thorns tugging at his plumage, until the ground sloped sharply downward. He slid, tumbling beak over tail feathers, down into a muddy ravine. He landed with a wet asterisk thwack, right in the center of a foul-smelling wallow. He blinked, shaking mud from his eyes, and looked up. Standing over him, caked in muck and looking thoroughly unimpressed, was Brutus. The largest, loudest, and most obnoxious of the wild hogs, the very nemesis Terrance had tried to serve up on a platter. Brutus snorted, a wet, guttural sound that vibrated in Terrance's chest. "Well, well," the hog grunted, chewing on a half-rotted root. "If it isn't the professor. You look like you've been plucked by a briar bush." "Quiet, you oaf," Terrance hissed, though his voice cracked with terror. "The humans, they're coming." "Let them come," Brutus said, scraping a hoof against a stone. "We'll give them the tusks. We always do." "Not these humans," Terrance whispered urgently, shaking his head. "They have boomsticks, they spit fire and lead, and they are hungry, Brutus, voracious, they are looking for a feast." Brutus stopped chewing. The other hogs, a rowdy gang of squealers who usually spent their days ruining Terrance's naps, gathered around, sensing the fear radiating from the turkey. "Feast?" Brutus asked, narrowing his beady eyes. "Yes, a great harvest celebration." Terrance improvised wildly, desperate to keep the hogs from making noise. And I tried to tell them that asterisk ham asterisk was the traditional dish of sophisticated palates, but they are savages. They want poultry. Just then, the sound of boots crushing brush came from the ridge above them. Shadows fell over the ravine. The humans were close. "They're up there," Brutus squealed, panic finally piercing his thick hide. "Listen to me," Terrance commanded, finding a shred of his usual authority. If we run separately, we die. You're too fat to outrun them, and I'm too brightly colored to hide. Who are you calling fat? Brutus grunted, though he looked nervously at his own flank. We need a diversion, Terrance said. You know the hollow log near the creek? The one you used to scratch your back. The itchy place, Brutus nodded reverently. If you and your boys charge through the underbrush away from the settlement, making as much noise as you usually do, which is a chaotic amount, they will think the flock has stampeded that way. Meanwhile, I will lead the stragglers through the fox tunnels back toward the marsh. Why should we help you? One of the smaller hogs squeaked. Because, Terrance said, meeting Brutus's eyes, if they catch me, they'll stop hunting. But if they don't catch me, they're going to keep looking until they find something big enough to feed 90 people. And that, my porcine friend, is you. Brutus weighed the logic, his snout twitching. The snapping of branches grew louder above. Run to the itchy place, Brutus barked to his herd. Make noise, break things. With a collective squeal that sounded like a demonic orchestra tuning up, the hogs exploded out of the ravine in the opposite direction. They crashed through bushes, knocked over saplings, and grunted with such ferocity that the ground shook. There, a human voice shouted from the ridge. The flock is moving west, chasing the river. After them, Captain Standish roared. The heavy footsteps thundered away, chasing the delightful cacophony of the hogs. Terrance let out a breath he felt he had been holding since sunrise. The irony was flavorfully rich. The very noise that had driven him to madness was now the only reason he was still breathless. He waited until the forest was silent again before creeping out of the mud. He couldn't go back to his usual roost. It was too close to the settlement. He needed to go deep into the shadow of the pines where the moss grew thick. But curiosity, that fatal flaw of the intelligent, tugged at him. He had to see it. He had to see the result of his grand scheme. Terrance took the long way around, circling the perimeter of the Pilgrim village, keeping to the shadows of the tree line. As the afternoon sun began to dip, casting long, golden rays across the clearing, the smells hit him. It was a mixture of wood smoke, roasting corn, stewed squash, and the savory, heavy scent of meat. Terrance swallowed hard. He crept up a small rise overlooking the settlement. What he saw was, despite his cynicism, breathtaking. Long tables had been constructed from rough-hewn planks stretching across the common area. They groaned under the weight of the harvest. There were baskets of red and yellow apples, mountains of shellfish, trenchers of venison, and bowls of steaming succotash. And there, in the center of the tables, were the turkeys. Terrance felt a pang of sorrow for his fallen brethren, distant cousins mostly, not the brightest birds, but birds nonetheless. They were roasted to a golden brown, glistening in the firelight. His plan had worked in the most twisted way possible. The holiday was a success. The menu was just wrong. But as he watched, the scene shifted from a display of carnage to something else. He saw the pilgrims, men and women in their drab, patched clothes, looking cleaner and happier than he had ever seen them. Their faces, usually pinched with the worry of starvation and sickness, were soft in the glow of the hearths. Then, from the edge of the woods near the coast, a procession arrived. It was Massasoit and his warriors, 90 strong. They didn't come with bows drawn, they came with deer slung over their shoulders and baskets of fish. Terrance watched, mesmerized. In the animal kingdom, territory was everything. You fought for your nut tree, you pecked for your space. But here, two different tribes, the pale ones from the sea and the people of the land, were clasping hands. He saw Governor Bradford motion for Massasoit to sit at the head of the main table. He saw children, pilgrim and native alike, running between the tables, chasing a stray dog, laughing in a language that needed no translation. Captain Standish, the man who had nearly blown Terrance's tail feathers off an hour ago, was laughing, slapping a warrior on the back as they exchanged a knife for a hatchet, admiring the craftsmanship. Grace, Terrance whispered to himself, a word he had picked up listening near the meeting-house window. It was a gathering of gratitude. They were celebrating just being alive. Terrance realized then that his scheme had been petty. He had wanted quiet. He had wanted to remove an annoyance. But these humans, flawed and dangerous as they were, had created a moment of perfect peace. A rustling in the bushes next to him made him jump. He fluffed his feathers, ready to fight, but it was just Brutus. The hog was panting, covered in scratches, twigs sticking out of his ears. "We lost them," Brutus wheezed, collapsing onto his haunches. "Ran them in circles until they fell over." "You did well," Terrance said softly. "Surprisingly agile for a creature of your circumference." Brutus didn't even argue. He peered down at the feast. His snout worked, sniffing the air. "Is that?" "Venison," Terrance said quickly, "and fish and corn." "And turkey?" Brutus asked. "Yes," Terrance admitted. "Sacrifices were made." Brutus stared at the firelight, the laughter drifting up the hill. The loud asterisk crash bang of a musket being fired into the air in celebration made the hog flinch violently. "Too loud," Brutus muttered. "Too much fire, too many people." "It is a bit much," Terrance agreed. "We're leaving," Brutus announced, standing up. "The herd and we talked it over in the brambles. This neighborhood is going to the dogs. Too much traffic, too many hunters. We're moving 3 valleys over past the big river. Good mud there. Quiet." Terrance's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the goal, the endgame. "A wise decision," Terrance said, trying to keep the glee out of his voice. "It's a dangerous world here. You need space." "You coming?" Brutus asked, looking at the turkey with a strange sort of respect. "You got us out of that hole. You're smarter than you look, bird." Terrance looked at the dark, tangled woods to the west, where the hogs would roam, and then back at the settlement and the patch of forest he called home. His hollow oak. His favorite scratching stone. The berry bush that got the morning sun. "No," Terrance said, puffing out his chest. "This is my home. Someone has to keep an eye on these humans. Make sure they don't burn down the forest with their celebrations." Brutus grunted. "Suit yourself. Try not to get roasted." "Try not to become bacon," Terrance countered. With a final nod, the hogs turned and melted into the darkness, their trotting hooves fading into silence. Terrance was alone. He sat there for a long time, watching the feast. He listened to the prayers being spoken, the songs being sung. He watched the fire die down to glowing embers. He saw the unity of it all, how fear had been replaced, even for just one night, with fellowship. He had failed to get them to eat ham. He had nearly been eaten himself. But as he turned and began the walk back to his own territory, the silence of the woods wrapped around him like a warm blanket. No grunting, no squealing, no fighting over acorns. He reached his favorite oak tree. It was quiet, perfect, blissful silence. Terrance hopped up onto his branch, settling his wings. He tucked his head, ready for the best sleep he had had in months. But before he closed his eyes, he looked back toward the settlement one last time, seeing the faint glow of the lanterns. "Happy Thanksgiving," he clucked softly into the darkness. "Same time next year, maybe we'll try for tofu." And with a satisfied sigh, the first Thanksgiving turkey drifted off to sleep. The king of his quiet forest, thankful, truly thankful, to live to gobble another day.